Hello everyone, Austin here with the Limestone Library. In one of our previous videos, we looked at a game from Paul Morphy, and in that game we highlighted the importance of developing our back row pieces and really only making necessary pawn moves when we really need to and when we have a really good reason to. And in that game we saw Paul Morphy just completely overwhelm his opponent because of how quickly he was able to develop his pieces. Well, the game that I want to look at today is similar, but the focus is going to be taken away just a little bit from development. Development is still going to be important, but I'm going to mostly highlight what to do once you've totally overwhelmed your opponent with development, and then how to finish that attack, or at least one of the ways that you'll need to know how to finish these kinds of attacks. So the game that we're taking a look at is from 1912, which sounds like, okay, well, who really played chess in 1912? I mean, was anyone really that good? Well, the game is from definitely one of the lower tier legends, which, still makes him a very strong chess player. The player playing white was Edward Lasker, and he was playing, I believe it was George Allen Thomas, which I don't know who George Allen Thomas is, and after this game, I don't know if he knows who he is either. The game is it's a brilliancy from White and just incredibly famous. It was played in a coffee shop actually, and if you play a game in a coffee shop that's so good that it becomes world famous, even 100 years later, I'd say it's a pretty darn good game. So White opens up with d4, and so we have a different opening from the Morphy game. Morphy opened up with the king pawn, but we still will get an exciting game, even though d4 games these tend to be a little bit slower and more positional. Now, if White gets the move again, undoubtedly their next move would be e4. They really want to get that e4 pawn break in as well, and get that space in the center with both of their pawns. So Black decides to play f5, and there's it looks like a bit of a strange move, perhaps because it opens up this diagonal to the king, but it is perfectly acceptable. It's not the most commonly played move here, but it should do just fine. Black didn't lose this game because of the opening, that's for sure. So Black does just have to pay attention to this diagonal and make sure that they don't allow their king to become attacked too easily. Now, White continues the game with knight to f3. So we have a pawn developed in the center, and then just developing a knight. And the idea is, well, simply to castle kingside. And this knight typically goes on f3 in these kinds of games. It's a really strong defender of the king, and it's just on a very solid square. So Black continues with pawn to e6, and this is a common move when you play f5. And the idea here is, well, I'm going to put my pawns on light squares, and my bishop will be blocked by all these pawns. But likely what we'll do is we'll fianchetto the bishop and put it on b7, and then we have really strong control of the light squares here. So again, that's just hammering in the idea that Black really doesn't want White to play e4 if they can help it. They want White to work for it. And that's exactly what White does. White continues the game and plays knight to c3, and this is maybe a bit of a concession. Nowadays, we're normally playing c4 and then moving the knight in behind it. You just have an extra, a little bit of extra control with the c4 move played first. That doesn't mean that this is necessarily bad, but we could put a little bit more pressure on Black perhaps by playing c4, or maybe we just get a better position for ourselves. This knight c3 move certainly is a bit quicker because it does avoid a pawn move. So we do have knight c3, and okay, Black continues and plays knight f6. So now we have some tussling over this e4 square mainly, and well, White looks at this and figures, okay, I only have one piece defending it. Black has two pieces attacking. I cannot safely move that pawn yet, but I really want to move that pawn, so I'm going to prepare this move, and I'm going to play bishop to g5, pinning the knight, so now the knight's not controlling that square anymore, and if white got to move again, certainly e4 would be the move. So black defends, plays bishop e7, and here we are back to normal. Black still has 2 pieces attacking this square. So white figures, okay, let's get rid of the knight. Bishop takes back as planned, and then white gets in their e4 push. Now here, it's very important for black to realize that there was a reason why they played f5. We talked about this in the Paul Morphy game, and I'll just very quickly reference this opening position, where after knight f3, black defended with d6, and then we had d4, and really, black should take here. This is... there's another move, knight d7, that black can probably get away with, and I mean maybe knight f6 and then knight d7 as well is probably better. But that's sort of a modern find that works for other complicated reasons. But the simple way to take care of this is just taking the pawn. That's why black played e5. They should take that pawn, lest they get attacked or lose space, something like this. So. And that's exactly what happened in the Morphy game. So a similar thing here, black figures, okay, well, I played f5 for a reason, let's take the pawn. Okay, so white takes back, that's why the knight's there. And here, well, black's sitting at this position and needs to figure out, okay, what's the next piece to develop here? How do I continue getting my pieces out? In this position, black plays b6. The idea being the one that I mentioned earlier from the opening position. Black wants to play bishop b7. There's 2 pawns in the way here. We're not going to move these pawns, that waste too much time to move 2 pawns. It creates some weaknesses, and if we move this pawn, we're also blocking this bishop. So it makes more sense just to make one simple pawn move, and then boom, there you go. You have the bishop on the longest diagonal on the board. So, or one of them, since there's a few, or a couple, I guess. So after b6, white starts to pressure a little bit, we'll say. Knight e5 is probably not a Paul Morphy move. Probably not a move that he would play. He might, just continue developing something like this. But we do have knight e5. I don't know if it's necessarily a bad move. It does have a very clear threat. The threat is just simply queen to h5. So that if we just do some kind of move like this, queen h5 hits pretty hard. The king can't move because queen f7 is mate. And after pawn to g6, well, we might see something like this. We should see something like this. And let me see. After, this is a bit tricky because usually in this position, as long as I'm looking at it right, usually in this position, after pawn takes, you will very happily take the rook. And it's my guess that that's why white thought this knight e5 thing would work, because black would see this position and say, okay, well, they can't take the rook, so I'm fine. Well, after queen takes g6, which you normally wouldn't do, because you're just winning 2 pawns for a piece, black is in a bit of a bind here. Certainly, I mean, we could go king f8, I guess, but knight takes f8 is the clear winner. I guess you could go queen takes f8 as well. I think I just prefer to, it seems like we're attacking. Let's leave the queens on. So you could definitely go knight takes f6. And then this is a tricky one as well, because after king e7, well, the queen's no longer guarding that bishop. So we can take here, and this is considerably worse than the alternative. After the king moving back, then we'll have this, king to e7, because we have to continue guarding the queen. And I'd be surprised if there wasn't a mate here. My guess is, actually, I'm sure this is pretty good, and we have to stay here to continue guarding the queen. And then knight f6, and I don't know, how do we... Yeah, this is, 17 for, okay, it's going up, yeah, so the computer really likes white. I was just looking. I'm not really sure what to do after something like king here. Oh, that's funny. Okay, so we can do this because if takes, then we come back and then we win the queen. So all kinds of really fun things for white to do if black is not careful here. So that knight e5 move, it may just look like a silly one move threat, but there is a lot more to that move than what is immediately obvious. So black has to be vigilant and not play bishop to b7. Instead, black does castle. So fortunately for black, we do, well, not for black. Fortunately for us, black castles because we get to see a much better attack than the one that I just showed you. So white continues development and plays bishop to d3. Seems perfectly fine, continuing to improve the position. And black plays bishop b7. Now it is important to note, in the Morphy game, we saw Morphy move his bishop to c4. And what a lot of players will do, especially a lot of club players and beginning players, they'll move their bishop to c4 every single game. And it is good most games. I'll give them that. I really like my bishop on c4. But only if it does something. And in this position, it's really just biting on a rock. So Edward Lasker sees this and figures, okay, well, bishop d3 is pretty strong. It attacks this very important focal point next to the castled king. So let's do it. Let's put the bishop there. After bishop to b7, white plays bit of an ambitious, what I guess I would call a caveman move with queen h5, but it makes perfect sense. It doesn't really make white's position worse. It definitely makes it better. White definitely is playing for tricks here, but this is okay to do as long as it makes your position better. So I definitely understand why queen h5 was played, and at the minimum, you're putting pressure on your opponent when you play moves like this. So once again, we get this position, and I'll go ahead and play the move for black, which was queen to e7. Black should have taken the knight. White has too much development here. And we'll see why black should have taken the knight without a doubt. But we'll stop at this position here just for a second because I just want to show, once again, in these very famous games where one experienced player is dismantling a good player, but someone not quite as experienced as them, we have this similar position again, where white has 4 developed pieces on excellent squares and a very clear plan, which is this focal point on h7. That's what they want to focus on to attack the king. And it's important too, white didn't just decide to attack. Don't just decide to attack. Instead, what white saw was, there's no knight on f6. This knight on f6 is the classical defender of the kingside castled king, and it's gone. That makes h7 weaker because there's no knight defending it. So let's pressure. And they pressured just by developing and making their position better, and it just so happened that their opponent made, I guess, one of the most brilliant mistakes of all time, because it led to one of the most brilliant king attacks of all time. So when we're looking at this position, black has a couple of glaring weaknesses here with the king and the focal point next to the king. So that's what we'll want to look at when we're in a position like this, right? We already have all of our pieces developed, so we need to finish the attack. So these are the weaknesses that we're going to be keying in on. So after we look at weaknesses, we should then look at tempo moves, which are checks, captures, and threats. But we really do want to hyper-focus in on checks and captures first, because these are very often just powerful moves, because they force our opponent to either A, get out of check, if you check them, they have to get out of check, or if you B, capture, it's very likely that your opponent has to recapture, otherwise they're going to be simply down material. So these are very strong moves. You can use these moves, checks and captures, to attack more than one weakness at a time. Because when you're checking or capturing your opponent, they have to react to that. You can attack other things. They continue reacting. And all of a sudden you have a ton of development, and they've just been defending the whole time, and they don't have development because they've been wasting this time. So after queen to e7, the first check that we should probably look at is knight to f7. Knight takes f6. So that's one check here that we see, and there's two more. There's the queen to f7 and then queen to h7. Now, in any given position, it's very common if you have, if you're out and attacking with the queen, it is very common for there to be a lot of queen checks. There might be 6 of them. There might be more than 6. In many positions, you cannot possibly find you cannot possibly look at every single one of these queen checks on every single move without running out of time. So what I would encourage is when you're looking at checks, look at the checks that attack your opponent's weaknesses first, right? So we've already analyzed the weaknesses. The king is weak because of the massive amount of white pieces around it. And this is weak because it's attacked once, defended once, and it's also x-rayed by the bishop. So we won't really look at this queen f7 check because black seems to have this square pretty much locked down. So the first check that we'll look at is knight takes f6. This is a reasonable one. Opens up the bishop to synchronize with the queen. It's a check. Everything seems to be pretty good. If the queen takes, we have checkmate. Pretty simple there. If the rook takes, we have checkmate in 2. Everything is forced. So that looks like a pretty promising idea, but if that was the idea, if it was that simple, then we probably wouldn't be looking at this. Black has another way to capture, and it's an unorthodox way, but black can capture with the pawn and use the queen to laterally defend the weakness on h7. So this was why black played this queen move. They saw that, well, white's really only threatening knight takes f6, and if I play queen e7, I can defend against that threat and have a pretty decent position here. If white wants to castle kingside, I mean, black playing rook h8 and then, king h8 and then rook to g8, I mean, that coordinates with the bishop really well, so black does have some attacking chances in this position once they get some development. So, yeah, this position black was pretty happy with. And why not? And why would they consider giving up their bishop like this if this was the only check that they saw was worth anything? Well, they didn't see this one. They didn't see here that queen takes h7 check. There might be something to this. Now, if you want to, after king takes, go ahead and pause the video and try to figure out here, well, how is white going to continue this attack after they've just given up the queen? I encourage you, look for tempo moves. That is the whole point of looking over this game. It is an excellent display of near perfect development from one side, and then how to overwhelm your opponent once you have that development with tempo moves. So, the rest of the game goes like this. We have a couple of checks here that we can look at. However, having the knight on f6 is very frequently a very strong position for the knight. There are a lot of mates that you can do with the knight on f6. For example, with the king being back here, if we put a rook here on an open board with just the knight guarding the rook, that's mate. That totally covers the king. Same thing if the rook is here. Again, on a totally open and empty board, the knight covers the rook, and it also covers this square. So the knight on f6 is very powerful. So if we did see this, knight takes f6 and then king h8, well, very simply, knight to g6 is checkmate. So black doesn't do that. I'm sure black saw this. And it's probably not clear when black started to panic. Maybe they, if it was me and I'm in this position where, okay, I don't want to give up my bishop. I only see this check. If my opponent's thinking for a while and then plays queen takes h7 and I didn't really calculate that move, I'd probably be panicking right here because people don't usually just give their queen away for no reason. So we have knight takes f6, double check, very important. And then king to h6. And now the question is, well, we want to continue playing checks. We have to. We're down a queen. If we give black a chance to breathe, we're going to lose very quickly. So what checks to play? We have a couple knight checks here. And there's this one, but we're not doing that. So we have a couple knight checks here. Which one is the right one? Typically, decisions like this are very hard to calculate. But I'll give you two sort of shortcuts or guidelines that can really help you in situations like this. The first being sort of a positional guideline. We've already moved this knight to f6 to attack. So we should consider moving a new piece that we maybe haven't involved on in the attack very recently. And that would be this one. We last moved it in the opening, within the first 5 moves, I believe. Somewhere around there. Oh, it was move 8. So still in the opening. It's been a while. It's move 12. And we have a very different position. We last moved the knight in a position where black's king was still relatively safe. Here, not so much. So we should move this knight. That's what our positional senses tell us. What about calculating? Well, if we move this knight, the king has 2 squares to go to. If we move this knight, the king has 1 square to go to. This makes it much easier to calculate. And very frequently when you're attacking your opponent or when you're hunting their king, when you have a wide open king and you're just hunting them and they can't really defend, the moves that give the king only one choice are very frequently the correct decisions. And we should explore these because they're easy to calculate. There's only one choice. So, knight check, the king has to go to g5. Very easy to calculate that one. Okay, so white continues the attack. How to check the king on the dark square? We can't really move the knights because they're defending each other. We only have a light squared bishop, so let's use a pawn. h4 check, it's guarded by the rook. The king only has 1 move and has to move to f4. This is also a common attacking strategy. When you've exposed the king, when you've extracted it from the castle position and you need to hunt the king on an open board, it is very wise to pull the king closer to your position. If you do this, it will only get easier to mate the king the closer it gets. Having the king here on d8, really hard. That's too far away from the rest of your pieces. f4 though, this king's pretty ridiculous. Okay, so white continues the attack. g3 check. This doesn't really matter. We're checking. Black does not have time to make any captures. They have to save their king, and they only have, once again, 1 square to go to. Okay, it is on a light square now. We still can't really move the knights. They'll get captured. We don't really want that. Honestly, maybe knight e5 leads to a mate eventually, but I think we're running out of checks there after knight e5, king g2. That's tough. We might be running out of good checks. I'm sure we could make it work, but bishop e2, which was played in the game, is just clearly the best. Once again, only 1 move, and we pull the black king closer to our position. And it's this position that when I give, if we just go back here, when I give this puzzle to students as a calculation exercise, and they, eventually they'll figure out, okay, knight takes f6 doesn't really work. Let's explore the queen move. When this puzzle is given, usually you can calculate pretty far when your opponent only has these single moves for their king. They only have 1 choice until they get to this position, and this position is really hard to see in your head. But on the board, maybe not so much. On the board, we have a very clear check here with rook to h2 check. And white has 1 last move, which is king to g1, and black has 1 last move, which is king to g1, and now it's white to move. And we have a couple moves that we can play here to bring this final piece into the game, but white decides on king to d2 with checkmate, ending in a lot of flair. Now, if they were playing pinball, I guess white loses, but they were playing chess in the coffee house, so in 1912, I guess they had pinball machines in 1912, maybe not in coffee houses, though. King d2 with, you can castle to win the game, too. This is important. I should show this, too, because there are some positions in games where you'll get a king hunt like this, and, maybe your king can't move. It is okay to castle and also get the checkmate. It's rare, but it's good to know as an extra pattern to have in your repertoire. Doesn't happen very often, but castling can be used aggressively. So, final position with King D2, and we get, like I said, one of the most famous games of all time, straight out of a coffee house, which is just awesome. So, let me know what you think about this one. The first time I saw it a few years ago, I was just blown away at the precision that White used to take care of the king here. So I thought I'd share this one with you guys. If you have any questions or you want to play a game with me, certainly any chess questions, I will leave my email and profile links in the description. Other than that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.